A win-win partnership or a debt trap? At a summit with African leaders, China's president dismissing claims of a new colonialism as he promised $60 billion in fresh funding for the continent. Can Xi Jinping's guests, though, afford to pay him back? Will his big Belt and Road initiatives make them beholden to Beijing? Leaders heard loud and clear his promise of no political strings attached to the funding. But how about his warning against vanity projects and how to curb corruption on some of those big projects? The same can be said of joint ventures with Western powers, in all fairness, for whom too often Africa was little more than about the extraction of raw materials. As the transition to homegrown industry and services awaits the continent, its population grows, the outside world is learning to dance to a different drum, but can you do business without better governance? What kind of a scramble for Africa are we now witnessing? Today in the France 24 debate, we're talking about the allure of Chinese money, and joining us, Ibrahim Anyang, researcher at the Institute of Asian and African Studies, who also teaches at Dakar's Sheikh Anta Diop University. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
We want to welcome from Brussels, Solange Guillot-Chatelard, research associate at the Free University of Brussels. Thanks for being with us again, Solange.
Thanks for having me.
We hope to be joining formerly from the World Bank, Louis Bédouchat, senior advisor at auditors and consultants, PricewaterhouseCoopers, and from Davis, California, former White House senior advisor on Africa, Grant Harris, CEO of Harris Africa Partners. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. More African leaders showed up in Beijing than at the most recent Africa Union summit. That should tell you something. Even Cameroon's Paul Biya was there. The reclusive 85-year-old often skips summits. A trip to China, the perfect way to forget accusations of corruption and repression back home ahead of next month's presidential election. And Biya's ears must have perked up when he heard China's president speak.
We don't interfere in the internal affairs of African countries, impose our will on the African countries, attach any political condition on the economic aid for Africa, nor do we seek selfish political gains in investment and financing cooperation with Africa. Ultimately, it is for the people of China and Africa to judge whether China-Africa cooperation is good or bad. No one can deny the remarkable achievements of our cooperation.
Ibrahim Anyang, that no political strings attached line, how will Africans interpret it?
How is Africa? I think during the summit FOCAC in Beijing 2018, there is a eight initiative. We in 2015 we have like the 10 areas where Chinese will be committed to improve the relationship between Africa and China by financing the agriculture, modernizations, industrializations, the health, trade and investment, infrastructure, trade and investment. But for this forum, they have a new initiative, what they call like the 8 initiative, and they change the model of where China will be committed now to improve the relationship between the two parts of
But that no political strings attached comment, your thoughts on it?
I think that there is no political. We at this summit we have like 3 new countries who joined the forum, like the Gambia, Sao Tome and Principe, and the other country is Burkina Faso. Like they broke up their relationship between them and Taiwan and joined the.
Does it mean that? Does it mean when he says no political strings attached that basically China doesn't care about governance issues?
Yeah, China is based his policies around the 5 principles. What they said, the 5 no. like the non-ingerence in the political.
No meddling in politics.
Yes, political affair in their countries, and they will not enter in the development policy of this country.
Solange Guillot-Chatelain, your thoughts on those remarks?
I think China is interested in results. I think saying that it's not interested in, it doesn't want to interfere in domestic politics can be misleading. I think compared to perhaps Africa's traditional partners and allies, namely Europe and the US, China acts, I think, in a very different way. It has a different modus operandi on the ground in the way that it sort of observes and follows political change and political evolution on the ground. I think they have a slightly different way of dealing with things. But I think that saying that governance, the Chinese people are not interested in governance is misleading. They're interested in seeing results being delivered on the ground. And of course, a condition for that is good quality governance. So I think we have to maybe look at it from that perspective. Of course, there's no such thing as no political strings attached. As my colleague has just mentioned, the recognizing China's one China policy is a condition, of course.
Dropping recognition of Taiwan for those three countries you mentioned.
Absolutely. I mean, if you compare that one condition to a whole series, if you like a sort of a gauntlet of obstacles that countries are asked to jump across in order to gain certain access to credit loans and grants that other countries offer Africa. China has a much simpler model, if you like. It has a much more direct way of breaking deals, making deals. And I think that is welcome to some extent, to a very large extent. But to say that it's not interested in governance at all would be wrong, I think.
Let's bring in Louis Bédouchat, formerly of the World Bank, now with PwC, who joins us from Abidjan, Ivory Coast. Louis, the message of the Chinese leader there, how is it being interpreted in 2018 when he talks about no political strings?
Can you repeat your question, because it was not very good in terms of audio. Please repeat your question slowly. I'm sorry for that.
When Xi Jinping talks about no political strings attached to the funding for projects on the continent, how is it being interpreted in today's world?
Okay, I understand your question. I think, like the lady just before said, China is a newcomer in Africa, and maybe came with, at the beginning, its own rules, which were the rules of the bad guy, So China came out of the international standard in terms of aid, not coming through the channel of the World Bank, not coming with the rules of the IMF. And obviously, it was a bit painful for the other players. But I think China is moving. China is moving forward, is moving towards a very, I would say, a more wise model. I wouldn't say that China is out of, doesn't respect, doesn't comply with governance. China is playing its game, which is putting on the table a certain amount of money. It's right to say that 10 years ago, 15 years ago, they did not comply with the environmental and social rules, with the classical rule of tenders. They come and they say, we'll put 10 billion on this project, for example, but you need to take this company, which obviously is a Chinese company, and that's it, But we must not forget that there is a huge deficit in infrastructure in Africa. And if you look at the story on the side of African countries, you have to find the money where it is, So there is a bilateral possibility, there is a multilateral, and there is a bilateral player which is coming with a lot of money. So you take the money where it is, and you satisfy the needs of your people. We must not forget that in the next 20 years, the most creative continent in terms of workforce will be Africa, and we need to satisfy the needs of these people by creating industry in Africa. And this is the game. This is the story.
And here comes then Xi Jinping with this pledge on top of the $60 billion of 3 years ago, a fresh $60 billion. Some of it is aid, some of it is loans. In the 1990s, campaigners like Oxfam and the pop singer Bono successfully lobbied the world's richest countries to forgive a good portion of Africa's crippling debt. Now, the amounts being borrowed are once again on the rise and at an alarming rate. And there you see that in that graph, oil-rich Angola, by the way, the most beholden to China, followed by Ethiopia, Zambia, Kenya, and also Ghana. And there you see the graph on the amount of Chinese loans to African governments. Back in April, when the IMF, speaking of Ghana, had paid out the last chunk of a $1,918 million loan to Ghana, it warned Accra to curb its borrowing habit. Fast forward to now, and here you see President Nana Akufo-Addo, who had a meeting with Xi Jinping in Beijing this week, announcing a 100-year infrastructure bond worth $50 billion, roughly 100% of Ghana's GDP. Let me ask you bluntly, Grant Harris, will Ghana be able to pay that back?
That's unclear. And it's also unclear not just because of the amount, but because of the lack of transparency when it comes to the conditions and when it comes to the circumstances. And that's something that really characterizes Chinese engagement. It would be inaccurate to say that China places great focus on good governance or on openness or really complies with any of the other best practices in terms of international lenders. And so what we see in many of these Chinese loans is, one, there isn't great regard for environmental or social impacts, negative or otherwise. And two, there isn't a lot known about what the conditions are. And then three, there's very little regard in some cases for the sustainability. And so you've seen not just an absolute number increase in the amount of loans, but for some countries, for instance, Djibouti, because of Chinese debt, the debt to GDP ratio of this very small country of less than 1 million people has shot up from 50% to 85%. And so this Chinese debt diplomacy really is going to be we'll see great effects in some countries.
And you penned a piece in Time magazine where you singled out Djibouti because Djibouti, of course, is home to French, U.S., and Chinese military bases. You're saying it's a national security question?
It is. Let's take the example of Sri Lanka, which is heavily leveraged to the Chinese government. The Chinese government invested in a port there, which many others considered to be a lemon of a project and had seen very little ship traffic. The Sri Lankan government was so heavily indebted to the Chinese government that ultimately it handed over control of that port, giving the Chinese an important port along a major waterway. If you translate that example to Djibouti or some other countries in Africa, China is often collateralizing these loans with natural resources, with issues with ports and with areas of geostrategic importance. And so in Djibouti, where China now has a military base and a country that is heavily leveraged to Beijing, China can be pulling political strings behind the scenes about Djibouti's openness to other military powers. It could also be trying to take the port or other geostrategic areas if Djibouti is unable to pay the amounts owed.
Solange Guillot-Chatelain, you agree?
I think raising the Sri Lankan case is a fantastic example because it sort of, it raised the first warning flag that, China is basically taking over, these are sort of the first signs of Chinese sort of colonial ambitions across the world, where it could effectively sort of start infringing on a nation's own sovereignty by taking over, even if it's the management of a port like, Britain and Hong Kong. It's taken over that port, at least the management of the port for the next 100 years. That's the agreement that they've signed, and they think that this will have a domino effect and be a risk to its influence at Western. It'll be a risk to see Chinese expand that kind of influence across Africa. I think we have to really put every individual case back into context. Sri Lanka has, critical strategic importance for Chinese maritime access, and we know that China needs access to the sea, which it does not have.
Well, in the case of Djibouti, Djibouti is an interesting.
And to secure
in the case of Djibouti,
1945.
Solange, it's of strategic importance to China, but also to France and the United States, you could argue.
Oh, absolutely. Of course it is. But, and Djibouti is actually this tiny little country is the first country where China has, established its military base, its military presence. So it also has a very important sort of symbolic role to play. But what I'm trying to say is that I don't think that China will, at least not at this stage, not in this first phase of consolidating its position on the African continent, it will not have this sort of aggressive reaction to the defaults on its debt. Ultimately, is what will happen if these countries default on their debt? Will China take over and come in and say, right, everything is ours now, we own everything? Or will there be room for negotiation? I think the critics say, they're going to step in and take over everything. They're going to conquer and consolidate and expand. And those who understand China, I think, in a more sort of a long-term perspective, I think they'll be much more sophisticated and much more cautious. Sri Lanka has no sort of, big, it's not situated, it doesn't have any sort of major regional allies. On the contrary, it has one major regional enemy, India. And I think if Zambia, for example, that is located in southern Central Africa, which has very important strategic neighbors, it's bordering Congo,
Zambia, you're
DRC,
saying has more leverage. I'm going to have to
$10 billion deal with.
I'm going to have to interrupt you because we're going to pick up on that point. We have to take a very quick break. We'll be right back. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate.
Okay, sorry.
Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate. The curtain has come down on a China-African summit that was well attended in Beijing, and that comes as countries not just on the continent but around the world are wondering about debt dependency on China. China touting its One Belt, One Road policy, saying it's not true, that we're talking about win-win when it comes to investment. With us to talk about it, Ibrahim Nyang, researcher at the Institute of Asian and African Studies, and who also teaches at Sheikh Anta Diop University, sociology in Dakar. From Brussels, Solange Guillot-Chatelard, research associate at the Free University of Brussels. Welcome back. Welcome back from Abidjan. He's formerly with the World Bank. Louis Bédouchat, senior advisor at Auditors and Consultants, PwC. And joining us from Davis, California, Grant Harris, CEO of Harris Africa Partners, a former White House senior advisor on Africa under the Obama administration. Grant, in that Time magazine article that we mentioned in part one, you wrote, quote, Chinese debt has become the methamphetamines of the infrastructure finance, highly addictive, readily available, and with long-term negative effects that far outweigh any temporary high. Do you take the point made by several of the panelists that Africa has a cruel need for funding for infrastructures, and the Chinese are there to offer it?
Yes, I do. I don't think the situation is black and white. Africa faces an enormous infrastructure gap, and African leaders should be welcoming capital from around the world to fund these projects. But that doesn't mean that it's 100% win-win or that it's great across the board. And I think that by dismissing concerns out of hand or saying that that's not how China works, or it may not be that blunt of an instrument, we're really doing a disservice to the situation and what's going on. And here's what we're looking at. some countries, whether it's Djibouti or its neighbors or Zambia or others, are taking on an unsustainable amount of debt from multiple sources, but much of it from China. China now has about 14% of the total debt stock of bilateral debt when you take South Africa out of the picture. It's a growing amount. We don't know the conditions. And these countries are going to be increasingly leveraged to repay that. When they're unable, China will make additional demands. These countries will have less money to spend on social services and other programs. It's somewhat of a downward spiral, which makes it more and more difficult to get money and access capital markets. So I think the fact that China is investing and making an important play in Africa, that has many beneficial consequences, but that doesn't mean that there isn't a downside here or some places where their practices really should change.
Lots of reactions on the hashtag F24 debate, by the way. One viewer, colonialism. Why is it colonialism when China seeks to invest in Africa? Grant, what do you do? Like, again, it's those infrastructure projects, those big ones. Like, for instance, there have been allegations of corruption surrounding the building of the rail line in Kenya. But you do need to build that rail line. So how do you go about it?
Well, you do need to improve infrastructure, of course, whether that's the right rail line, whether they should have rehabilitated the previous rail line for a cheaper amount. Those individual projects can be debated. My point is not that Chinese investment in infrastructure is a bad thing. My point is that for as much good as Chinese investment is doing, there is an underbelly here. And it would be important to have transparency in the conditions. It would be important also to avoid corruption. One thing that's happening, for instance, in Kenya and other countries is the Chinese approaching individual ministers, making shadowy side deals, and really increasing the amounts that are taken on without any kind of consolidated analysis, without looking at what the pros and the cons might be. Chinese practices are not in accordance with European or United States anti-corruption practices, to say the least. And so I think that we need to shine a light on how these investments are made. The fact that investments are being made is great, but they should be made in a way that is conscious of environmental conditions, social impact, use of local labor, technology transfer, and anti-corruption goals.
Louis Béduchat, is China's approach to contracts on those big infrastructure projects that you were mentioning any different from that of France, of Britain, of the United States?
Yeah, just one word before answering your precise question, Francois. You must not consider a kind of a Manichaeist approach with bad China, stupid Africans, and good Europeans. Maybe reality more complicated. China is facing very smart countries. I'm presently in Côte d'Ivoire. And, 2 hours ago, I was discussing with an official of Côte d'Ivoire. He was trying to finance university. He has an offer from the Islamic Development Bank, an offer from China, a direct offer from China, and another offer from French IFD. So the guy is trying to manage this, the scarcity of money. So that's the first point. And second point I want to make, please let us try not to consider African countries as a kind of collection of idiots country, with no ability to appreciate what the Chinese offer is. These guys are not naive. Chinese obviously are not naive, but Africans are not naive as well. They understand very well that it's a newcomer, it's a new way of doing business, so they must adapt their attitude to this newcomer. But money is there. I'm sorry to be insisting on that. We need to be realistic. And I fully approve what has been said by my colleague previously. Chinese have to comply with the standard rules of environmental and social. Chinese have to comply with the standard anti-corruption, anti-bribery rules. But, in front of China, there are major countries, major countries. The 5 countries where China invested is Ethiopia, Morocco, Egypt, Angola, and South Africa. All these countries are very smart countries. Very smart countries. That's it.
All right. And by the way, it's not just about public debt.
It's the issue.
Sorry, go ahead, Grant Harris.
I don't think there's any implication that any country is dumb, so to speak. I do think that there's a great disparity in leverage. China is offering a great deal of money, and from an African leader perspective, no matter how intelligent any individual might be, there's short-term calculations, there's a lack of certain information, there are capacity issues in many African governments. That's not to imply a lack of intelligence. But I don't think that casting aspersions like that really addresses the fundamental point. I think we need to get at how these practices are conducted and where they're good and where they're harmful.
And do you take Solange Guillot-Chatela's point that countries like Zambia, like Djibouti, have much more leverage than does a Sri Lanka, for instance?
I don't think that Djibouti has a lot of leverage negotiating with China. I think that the amounts being offered and the calculations of the Djiboutian government make them incredibly attractive, and they're not thinking about the same issues that I, as a former American government official or other European officials, may hope in terms of the governance impact and the like. It's not to say that the governments are dumb. It's not to say that they have no leverage at all. But I do think that Chinese largesse can be very attractive, and that doesn't make it the right means of investment. If Djibouti is so highly leveraged, its debt to GDP ratio is 85% now, thanks to Chinese loans. And the Chinese, just a few miles away from their new military base, opened up a $3.5 billion special economic zone. It gives them a disproportionate amount of influence with that government. It's not in any African government's interest to be beholden to a single foreign entity or power like that. They'd be very wise to diversify their investment streams and to do all they can to attract other interests too.
Solange Guillot-Chatela?
Yeah, I mean, I take all of Grant's comments, and I agree with many of them. I think once again, context is key in this debate. And Djibouti is one of the extreme cases in Africa. It has high strategic military importance for China, and it is highly indebted to China. But if you look across the board, if you look across Africa, actual studies, particularly a recent report from the Johns Hopkins University, the China-Africa Research Initiative, proves and demonstrates that China alone is not contributing to debt distress across the continent. What you have are structurally asymmetrical loan relations between these countries and a whole series of different creditors, China being only one of them. And they also confirm that if China will continue to extend loans to these countries, they will, of course, take into consideration the existing debt situation that these countries are already in before they extend further credit lines. So the point here is that China alone right now is being singled out as a country that is plummeting these countries, sort of drowning them in debt, where their entire economies are extroverted. They're entirely dependent, well, many of them are dependent on external sources of finance. These can be bilateral sources of finance. This can be private finance, commercial finance. But this is finance coming from a whole host of different partners. But we're sort of singling out the Chinese. Yes, the Chinese government, the state-backed finance is a very important player. And it's likely to continue being a strong player. We don't know how strong it will be, and this is uncertain, and that's why all eyes are on China at the moment. But I think it's important also to have the numbers, to do the analysis, to crunch the numbers, to do the digging, to do the studying, the analysis, and to give us more clarity about the actual facts, that are on the ground. And I think the facts show us something that is slightly less scary. This doesn't mean that the tendency might change or the tendency can be an unsustainable one. I think also we're talking about African leaders. I fully agree with my French colleague that do not underestimate the intelligence and the strategic ability of local African leaders and government officials. But I also think we should not underestimate Chinese leaders. I think Chinese leaders are also fully aware that throwing money at a continent is not a sustainable solution for development. China wants strong trade partners. China wants strong military partners. China wants strong economies around it. It wants to see, healthy, operating, dynamic economies around it. And it's not interested in seeing countries crumble under debt. I don't think that's China's objective. But what it has done is gambled on globalization. China has basically put its money on the liberal horse, which ended the Cold War in the 1990s. It's gambling on more openness, it's gambling on more trade, on more mobility of goods, of people, of finance. Basically the recipe that the US, Washington and London have been peddling for the last half a decade since the Second World War, you know. And now that China is basically picking up where they left off, US, because of Trump's protectionism, and the UK because of parochial nationalism. China is picking up where these people have left off. It's saying yes to globalization, yes to the liberal doctrine to some extent that says more mobility, more flows, more connectivity, more access or easier access to markets for everyone everywhere will lead to, you know, more economic opportunities or more significant opportunities for development. That's the gamble that China is putting its money on, and that is really what the Belt and Road Initiative is about. And just let me finish
Sure.
on an issue of perspective here. Again, the numbers, just for the numbers, China has pledged 60 billion of grants and loans and finance, and it also pledged 60 billion at the last FOCAC meeting in 2015. Just to give you an idea of perspective, Africa's annual infrastructure deficit on an annual basis is $170 billion. So this really puts sort of the numbers into perspective.
And there's a cruel need for that investment. And by the way, that investment isn't just
I
big.
fully support the...
Yeah, Louis, I just want to just, because we're running short on time, broach something that's important, which is it's not just about big projects that happen from government to government. It's also about small businesses. It used to be one way you'd have raw materials going out, the other cheap textiles and medicine. All that has long since changed. It's a France 24 report from Lagos, Nigeria.
Behind this red fortress is Lagos's Chinatown. The dozens of wholesalers with shops here mainly import textiles. Lulu's overseen the marketplace since it opened in 2005. For Chinatown traders, business has never been better since transactions are now possible in both yuan and nairas.
This measure is all anyone can talk about at the moment within our community in Lagos, because we are aware that this will be beneficial and very useful to everyone. It's going to facilitate ties between our two economies. For us Chinese here, and for Nigerians there in China, it will be easier, faster, and more convenient to place our orders and get what we need.
Funmi Komolafe is checking her order that's arrived from China. She sells children's clothes, and to increase her profits, she looked into trading in yuan. 3 Nigerian banks offer the service, but she found the procedures put in place by the central bank too cumbersome.
You have to apply for a Form M, you have to bring an invoice from there, it has to be goods that some tool that they approve of before you can bring it. So that way, it is not of immense benefits to people in the informal sector.
The National Association of Nigerian Traders strongly backed the currency agreement. For them, it means more electronic transactions between China and Nigeria and better quality control of Chinese imports.
Substandard goods are getting too much. We need to make sure that adulterated goods, fake goods, do not have their ways into this country again.
Nigeria-China trade has grown exponentially over the last few decades, but as Nigerian companies still struggle to find suppliers locally, trade relations remain disproportionately in favor of China.
Ibrahim Nyang, what strikes you when you watch that report and that official saying that, well, thanks to trading in yuan, we're sort of bringing the informal sector on board now?
Yes, so I would like to talk for the debate between the sign of optimistic and the sign of pessimistic. I think, for me, in my opinion, like if we organize the debate like between the China optimistic and China pessimistic, it does not really make sense for Africans continent. Like for me, we need to think about which kind of alternative the Chinese authorities propose for the African country, and if the African country they have the agenda to deal with the Chinese authority.
So for those Nigerian business people,
yes,
trade with China, how is it changing?
For there's Nigerian business, the case that we have for the Nigerian business is the same case like the Senegalese business. Like they are confronted with the Chinese goods, which are imported from the city like Guangzhou, like Yiwu, and those kind of goods present a danger for the local industrialization. That the debate for me is
it'll always be cheaper than anything that's homegrown?
Yes, it's more cheaper than what we have produced in our company. That is mean like which kind of relationships we can build to set up good industrializations, how we can transfer skills from Chinese.
Is that starting to happen?
A little bit. The level is not so high. If we analyze the company which are set up in Africa, according to some publication and some deals with the Chinese authority, because we have settling up some specific zones economics in Africa, and most of them they are working on textile. Even African country, they have expertise in textile. What we need is like to diversify the sector, that we can transfer more skills and help African countries to build an industrializations.
Louis Bedoucha, the backbone of any economy are its small businesses. We're seeing that you heard the point there made by Ibrahim Enyang. The big problem is that, especially when it comes to textiles, it's always going to be an uphill struggle competing against Chinese imports. What do you do to help a burgeoning industrialization of Africa?
That's a very good question. We here in Abidjan, we are fighting to change, to bring a new model, which is the first model of Africa being to export raw material and to be paid for that, and the new model being to bring transformation industry to Africa, which is probably the pinnacle of the fight of many African leaders. And whatever the size of the company, what is very important for African countries is to extract from primary sector to go to secondary. What is probably the success of Ethiopia, of Egypt, and Morocco is that they succeed to bring in. For example, Renault in Morocco and many African countries would dream to have a huge industry, creative of secondary activity and suppliers of these activities in Africa. And this is probably something we must think. And China is probably willing to change the model and not to be considered as simply give me your raw material and I will give you money, and maybe to change and to maybe to bring to Africa some transformation industry to change a bit their economic model, because I think there is a change in the paradigm, as we say, or the model of Chinese economy, and African must take this opportunity, very important opportunity, to create industry in Africa, which is the fight of the century.
So you're saying that the Chinese have an open ear when it comes to trying to help burgeoning cottage industries in sub-Saharan African nations in particular?
I think that I would say the risk is that China transferred to Africa, I would say the dark industry, the dirty industry, for example, energy from coal or things like this, But I think we can trust African leaders to say to China, listen, you want to come here, you want to invest in our countries. We need automotive industry, we need computer industry, because we have a lot of young people coming to activity, and we need to to give them a job. And this is probably something African leaders like Ouattara, like the Congolese, like DRC, like Ethiopia should discuss with the Chinese, leader, bring industry, Chinese industry to Africa.
Solange Gros-Chatelard, last week, you had the visits of the British Prime Minister and the German Chancellor to the African continent. You heard Louis Bédouchat talking about the automobile industry. When she was in Nigeria, Angela Merkel and her host, Muhammadu Buhari, talked about Volkswagen, perhaps investing there. What do you think when you see this week the summit in Beijing, last week the visit of Theresa May and Merkel? Your thoughts on what the rapport is between Africa and the rest of the world right now?
Well, I think comparing, China hosting, dozens of heads of states compared to, European regional bilateral relations is a fantastic example of how Europe has lost the game and has lost its upper hand in Africa. It's game over. Sorry, it's game over. Merkel essentially was in Africa, yes, okay, to push manufacturing jobs and maybe the odd investment project here and there, but that pales compared to what China does on a continental scale, not only in Africa, but in Eurasia, on the Eurasian landmass and all across the world.
You had that EU-Africa summit last
Merkel
December.
was in West Africa too. Yes, but Merkel, if you're talking about the Merkel and May visit specifically, Merkel is out there to curb immigration. That was her #1 priority, is how can we stop this hemorrhage of people coming into Europe and causing all this social tension in Germany, and how she can find ways of subcontracting responsibility for that into poorer countries like Greece and others in Turkey, in the Mediterranean. And May essentially is now reaching out because she's desperate for partners because of Brexit. So what we're really seeing is, sort of individual European countries dealing with their specific national agenda, fine. Whereas China is working on a whole other scale. It has a vision for the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years. The entire planet is involved and has a role to play in that vision. It's not what Britain is offering Africa when it goes to Africa. That is not what Merkel is offering Africa when she goes to 3 countries. China is a very different kind of player. It's a sign that we fully enter, a China-centric world order. That does not mean that China will be the only sort of hegemonic power. It doesn't mean that the US has lost its hegemonic position. It means we're in a very critical time of hegemonic transition. We hopefully will move to a multi-power system where there'll be different centers of power. China and East Asia will certainly be a fundamental and crucial center of gravity. And that is, I think, essentially what this means. I'd just like to, if I may, go back to the labor issue.
Solange, unfortunately, the clock has caught up with us, so we're gonna have to leave it there. I want to thank you so much, though, for joining us from Brussels. I want to thank Grant Harris for joining us from Davis, California, Louis Bédouchat in Abidjan, Ivory Coast, and Ibrahima Niang for being with us here in our Paris studios. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.